A broken society's reflection. The train station pulsed with life, a cacophony of hurried footsteps, screeching train whistles, and murmured conversations weaving together the symphony of urban chaos. Among the bustling crowd, people carried their stories, burdens, and aspirations in bags slung over shoulders or dragged behind them. For most, the station was a transitory place, a brief stop between destinations. For others, like Officer Matteo Russo, it was a hunting ground where he sought to enforce the law with what he considered efficiency and precision. But beneath Matteo's badge and uniform simmered deep-seated biases that had shaped him into a man feared more than respected. At 40 years old, Matteo was a veteran of the force, known for his sharp instincts and unrelenting demeanor. His tall, muscular frame moved with a calculated intensity that mirrored his internal drive. Yet those who worked closely with him whispered about his prejudices, his disdain for the marginalized, and his propensity to let personal vendettas fuel his professional decisions. Today, the bustling train station would provide the stage for one such decision, one that would unravel truths long buried. A cry for help. Matteo had been stationed near Platform 12 when a sharp, panicked cry pierced the air. Robbery. A woman's voice yelled, drawing every eye toward a commotion near the ticket counters. Without hesitation, Matteo sprinted toward the scene, weaving expertly through the throng of travelers. His focus locked on the source of the chaos, a frail black woman in a wheelchair. She was elderly, perhaps in her 60s, with sunken cheeks that hinted at years of hardship. Her faded dress clung to her thin frame, and her lap appeared swollen, almost as though she were several months pregnant. But something about her demeanor struck Matteo as suspicious. Her eyes darted nervously, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair as she maneuvered away from the crowd with surprising haste. Matteo's instincts flared, his internal narrative filling in the gaps with assumptions. Why would a woman like her be here, alone, in this state? He strode forward, his hand resting on the baton at his side. "Stop right there," he barked, his deep voice cutting through the din. The woman froze, her body trembling as she turned to face him. "I didn't do anything," she stammered, her voice shaky, but laced with desperation. "Please, officer, I'm just trying to leave." Before Matteo could respond, a white woman in her 30s burst through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. "That's her," she shouted, pointing a manicured finger at the elderly woman. "That filthy old woman bumped into me and stole my bag." The crowd rippled with murmurs, some stepping back to give Matteo space, while others craned their necks to watch the unfolding drama. Matteo's jaw tightened, his gaze shifted between the accuser and the accused, the latter now visibly shaking. "I'm just an old woman," the black woman pleaded. "I didn't take anything. Please, let me go." Matteo wasn't swayed. Years of patrolling had hardened him against pleas of innocence, particularly from those he already viewed with suspicion. "Stand down," he ordered, his tone icy. He reached for her lap and, with a swift motion, pulled at the swollen area beneath her dress. What he revealed drew audible gasps from the crowd. Hidden beneath the fabric was the accuser's purse, its bright red leather impossible to miss. The elderly woman's trembling intensified as Matteo held up the evidence. I didn't mean to," she stuttered, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. "I'll return it. Just let me go." An act of cruelty. Matteo's patience had run out. He cuffed the woman with a swift, almost practiced efficiency. "You think you can play innocent and get away with this?" he growled. "We're going to the station." "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I can't manage the wheelchair on my own. My legs." Matteo's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering to her limp legs. "You're not fooling anyone," he sneered. "That fake belly proves you're not above lying. Who's to say your disability isn't just another act?" The crowd watched in tense silence as Matteo, consumed by his frustration, grabbed the wheelchair and pushed it forward with a forceful shove. The woman tumbled out, landing hard on the cold, unforgiving floor. Her cry of pain echoed through the station, eliciting shocked gasps and murmurs from the onlookers. It was then that Matteo noticed something he couldn't ignore. Her legs remained limp and unmoving as she tried, in vain, to lift herself off the ground. A wave of unease washed over him, but he quickly buried it beneath his characteristic bravado. "Get up," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I can't," she whispered, her face contorted in pain. "I'm paralyzed." Matteo felt a flicker of doubt, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He hauled the woman back into her wheelchair, his grip rough and impatient. "You'll get your chance to explain at the station," he muttered, wheeling her away. The woman behind the crime. At the station, the elderly woman sat slumped in her wheelchair, her hands cuffed and her eyes downcast. She introduced herself as Sadie Thompson, a 65-year-old widow living in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. With no children to support her and no means of earning a living, she had been driven to desperation by hunger and poverty. "Stealing isn't who I am," she said softly, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I've just been so hungry, so alone." Matteo's expression remained stony as he stood across from her. "Spare me the sob story," he said, his tone laced with contempt. "People like you always have an excuse." Sadie didn't respond. Her shoulders sagged further, the weight of her shame and exhaustion pressing down on her. As the hours passed, she drifted into a restless sleep, her frail body leaning awkwardly in the wheelchair. It was then that Matteo noticed something. A dark birthmark peeking out from beneath the collar of her dress. His breath caught in his throat. The shape of the mark, the way it curved like a crescent moon, it was eerily familiar. Memories he had worked hard to suppress came rushing back with startling clarity. The dark, windowless shed, the gnawing hunger, the sound of sobbing children. Matteo had been just 5 years old when he and several other white children were kidnapped by a black couple and held for ransom. The trauma had left scars far deeper than he cared to admit, scars that had festered into a deep-seated hatred for black people. The woman who had abducted him bore a birthmark just like Sadie's. Matteo's pulse quickened as he stared at the sleeping woman. Could it be her? Could this frail, desperate woman be the same person who had stolen his childhood? The idea both terrified and invigorated him. He had spent decades trying to bury the pain of that experience, but now, the chance to confront one of his captors was within reach. A dangerous obsession. Determined to uncover the truth, Matteo dove into the station's archive of cold cases, searching for anything that might confirm his suspicions. The kidnapping case had occurred over 3 decades ago, and the details were murky at best. There were no photographs of the suspects, only vague descriptions that matched Sadie's appearance. "It has to be her," Matteo muttered to himself, his hands trembling as he sifted through the files. "It has to be." But there was only one way to know for sure. Sadie's husband. Matteo decided to release Sadie, under the guise of compassion, and follow her discreetly. If she led him to her husband, Matteo could finally uncover the truth and bring both of them to justice. As he made his decision, uncertainty gnawed at him. Was this the right thing to do, or was he letting his personal demons cloud his judgment? Matteo pushed the questions aside. For him, this wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about vindicating his past and reclaiming the power he had lost as a child. When Sadie was released later that evening, she wheeled herself out of the station, her face etched with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Matteo followed at a distance, his heart pounding with anticipation. The trail she left would lead him into a part of the city he had rarely ventured, a dilapidated slum where crumbling buildings stood as a testament to neglect and systemic failure. It's no surprise, Matteo thought as he trailed her through the darkened streets. Filthy places for filthy people. Little did he know, the journey he was about to undertake would force him to confront not only Sadie's truth but his own. And the answers he sought would upend everything he thought he knew about justice, prejudice, and redemption. Shadows of the past. Matteo Russo sat at his desk in the police station, the pale glow of his computer screen illuminating the growing unease on his face. Sadie Thompson had been released a few hours earlier, and Matteo's decision to follow her had been spur of the moment. He told himself it was about justice, about uncovering the truth behind the woman who had stolen his childhood. But deep down, Matteo knew his motives were more complicated. The shadows of his past, the kidnapping, the hunger, the fear, still haunted him, and seeing Sadie's birthmark had brought those memories flooding back like a tidal wave. He pulled up the old case files, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed. The kidnapping had taken place more than 3 decades ago, in a different city and a different time. Matteo had been 5 years old, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood with his parents. He remembered the warm summer evening when the black couple had approached him and other children playing in a park, offering candy and promises of fun. Matteo had trusted them, as children often trust adults. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. The details of the case were burned into Matteo's memory. The small dark shed where they were held, the cries of the other children, the hunger that gnawed at their bellies. The couple had demanded a ransom from the parents, and though the children were eventually rescued, the trauma lingered. Matteo had spent years in therapy, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the scars remained. His hatred for black people had grown from those scars, unchecked and unexamined, shaping the man he had become. As Matteo scrolled through the case notes, he found few details about the suspects. The couple had managed to evade capture, leaving behind only vague descriptions. A black man and woman, both in their 30s at the time, with no identifying marks, except for a crescent-shaped birthmark on the woman's neck. Matteo's jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair. The birthmark he had seen on Sadie Thompson's neck was identical. Could it really be her? Could this frail, desperate woman be the same person who had stolen his innocence all those years ago? Matteo didn't know, but he was determined to find out. The slum. When Matteo left the station, he spotted Sadie in her wheelchair, slowly making her way through the city streets. Her movements were labored, her frail hands gripping the wheels with visible effort. Matteo followed at a distance, careful to remain unnoticed. The streets grew darker and more desolate as they entered a part of the city Matteo rarely visited. The buildings were crumbling, their facades stained with years of neglect. Trash littered the sidewalks, and the air smelled of decay and desperation. Sadie eventually turned down a narrow alley, her wheelchair bumping over the uneven pavement. Matteo hesitated for a moment before following, his hand instinctively resting on the baton at his side. He didn't trust this place, or the people who lived here. To him, this was a haven for criminals, a breeding ground for the very kind of people he had spent his career trying to eradicate. At the end of the alley, Sadie stopped in front of a dilapidated building with boarded-up windows and a door that hung crookedly on its hinges. She knocked twice, and after a moment, the door creaked open. A man's voice called out from inside, and Sadie wheeled herself in, the door closing behind her. Matteo waited a few minutes before approaching the building. He peered through a crack in the boards covering one of the windows, his breath catching as he saw the scene inside. A fragile life. The interior of the building was as decrepit as its exterior. The walls were bare, the floors littered with discarded items that served as makeshift furniture. In the dim light, Matteo could make out Sadie and an older black man sitting at a small table. The man was tall and thin, his face lined with age and hardship. His hands trembled slightly as he held Sadie's, their fingers entwined in a gesture of quiet solidarity. "I'm sorry, William," Sadie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to steal. I didn't want to shame us like this." The man, William, shook his head. "You did what you had to. Sadie, we're starving. No one's going to help us. No one's going to care." Sadie's shoulders shook as she began to cry. "I can't keep doing this. I'm too weak. My legs, they're useless. And now the police." She choked on her words, her frail body trembling. William moved closer, wrapping his arms around her. "We'll figure something out," he said softly. "We always do." Matteo watched the scene unfold, his stomach twisting with conflicting emotions. He had come here expecting to find a den of criminals, a confirmation of his biases. Instead, he saw two broken people, clinging to each other in the face of overwhelming despair. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt about his assumptions, a flash of memory. As Matteo continued to watch, his mind wandered back to the past. He remembered the woman who had kidnapped him, strong, determined, her voice commanding as she barked orders at her accomplice. That woman had been nothing like the frail, trembling figure he now saw before him. Could Sadie really be the same person? Or was Matteo letting his hatred blind him? A sudden noise snapped Matteo out of his thoughts. The door to the building creaked open, and another figure entered, a younger man, perhaps in his 20s, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet confidence. Matteo tensed, his hand tightening on his baton. Was this their accomplice? Another criminal drawn into their web. The man approached Sadie and William, kneeling beside them. "I brought some food," he said, pulling a small bag from his jacket. "It's not much, but it's enough for tonight." Sadie looked up at him with gratitude. "Thank you, Elijah. You're a good boy." Matteo's grip on his baton relaxed slightly. The younger man didn't seem threatening. If anything, he appeared to be a kind-hearted individual trying to help his struggling parents. But Matteo wasn't ready to let go of his suspicions. He decided to wait, to gather more information before making his move. Uncovering the truth. Over the next few days, Matteo continued to follow Sadie and her family, documenting their movements and interactions. He saw Elijah leave for work early in the morning, dressed in the uniform of a local delivery service. He watched William venture out to scavenge for scraps of wood and metal, which he sold for a pittance at a nearby junkyard. And he observed Sadie, confined to her wheelchair, struggling to navigate the city's unforgiving streets. The more Matteo watched, the more his assumptions began to crumble. These weren't hardened criminals. They were survivors, doing whatever they could to stay alive in a society that had abandoned them. And yet Matteo couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Sadie was connected to his past. Driven by his obsession, Matteo decided to confront Sadie directly. He would demand answers, force her to acknowledge the truth about her role in his kidnapping. But as he prepared to make his move, a new question began to form in his mind. A question that made him pause. What if he was wrong? A reckoning approaches. Matteo stood outside the dilapidated building, his heart pounding. He had spent his entire life justifying his hatred, convincing himself that it was rooted in truth. But now, faced with the reality of Sadie's life, he wasn't so sure. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Inside, Sadie, William, and Elijah exchanged wary glances. Sadie's voice trembled as she called out, "Who is it?" Matteo hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's Officer Russo. I need to talk to you." The room fell silent, the weight of Matteo's words hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, William wheeled Sadie toward the door and opened it, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. "What do you want?" William asked, his voice firm. Matteo met his gaze, his own voice uncharacteristically soft. "I just want to talk." As he stepped inside, Matteo realized that this confrontation wouldn't just be about uncovering the truth about Sadie. It would be about confronting the truth about himself. The confrontation. Matteo Russo stepped into the dimly lit room, his boots echoing against the warped wooden floorboards. The air inside was heavy, a mixture of mildew and desperation that clung to every corner. Sadie sat in her wheelchair, her frail frame trembling slightly, while William stood protectively behind her, his aged hands gripping the back of her chair. Elijah, the younger man, lingered in the background, his eyes darting between Matteo and his family. Matteo's presence filled the small space, his uniform an imposing reminder of authority. For a moment, silence reigned, thick and oppressive, as the tension crackled like a live wire. Sadie's eyes avoided Matteo's, her face a mask of exhaustion and apprehension. "What do you want?" William asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. He was clearly a man who had learned to stand his ground, even in the face of intimidation. Matteo hesitated, his usual confidence wavering. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, imagining it as a triumphant confrontation where he would unmask the truth and deliver justice. But now, standing before this broken family, doubt crept in like a shadow. "I need answers," Matteo said finally, his voice sharper than he intended. He turned his gaze to Sadie, the birthmark on her neck seared into his memory. "About you. About who you are, and what you've done." Sadie looked up at him, her tired eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've already told you everything," she said softly. "I'm just an old woman trying to survive." "Survive?" Matteo snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think that justifies stealing. You think that excuses what you've done in the past." William stepped forward, placing himself between Matteo and Sadie. "You don't know us," he said firmly. "You don't know what we've been through. Don't stand there and judge us like you're some kind of saint." Matteo's jaw tightened. "I know enough," he said, his voice cold. "I know that mark on her neck. I know what it means." The past resurfaces. The room fell into a stunned silence. Sadie's hand instinctively rose to touch the crescent-shaped birthmark on the back of her neck, her fingers trembling. William's eyes narrowed, his protective demeanor giving way to confusion and alarm. "What are you talking about?" William asked cautiously. Matteo took a step closer, his gaze fixed on Sadie. 35 years ago, I was kidnapped, taken from a park along with other children. We were held for ransom by a black couple, people who looked just like you." His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "The woman who took us had a mark just like that on her neck." Sadie's face went pale, her lips parting in shock. "Kidnapped," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Matteo said, his tone hard. "For days, we were locked in a shed, starving, scared out of our minds. My parents paid the ransom, but the people who did it got away. And now, after all these years, I find you, with the same mark." William shook his head, disbelief etched on his face. "You think Sadie, my Sadie, did that? That she's some kind of monster?" "Don't lie to me," Matteo growled. "If it wasn't her, then who?" The timing, the mark, it all adds up. A story untold. Sadie's hands gripped the edges of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. Her breathing grew uneven, and tears began to string down her face. For a moment, she couldn't speak, as though the weight of Matteo's accusation had stolen her voice. Finally, she raised her head, her voice trembling but resolute. I didn't kidnap anyone, but I know what you're talking about." Matteo's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his thoughts. "Explain." Sadie took a shaky breath, her gaze flickering to William and Elijah, as if seeking their silent support. "I grew up in a neighborhood where poverty was all we knew. I was just a teenager when I got involved with a man named Lawrence. He was older, charming, and he had a way of making you believe he could fix everything." William's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. It was clear this was a chapter of Sadie's life he hadn't wanted to revisit. "Lawrence wasn't who I thought he was," Sadie continued, her voice cracking. "He was dangerous, controlling. He had this idea that he could make money by any means necessary. I didn't know the full extent of what he was doing until it was too late." Her gaze locked onto Matteo's, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I didn't kidnap those children, but Lawrence, he did, and I was too scared to stop him." A fractured truth. Matteo's chest tightened, his mind racing as he tried to process Sadie's words. "You expect me to believe you were just an innocent bystander?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Sadie nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I was a coward. I didn't speak up. I didn't go to the police. I was terrified of what Lawrence would do to me if I betrayed him. When the ransom was paid, he disappeared, and I never saw him again." "And what about you?" Matteo demanded. "What did you do after that?" "I tried to start over," Sadie said, her voice breaking. "I left the city, changed my name, and cut ties with everyone I knew. But I've been running ever since." William stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "She's not that person anymore. She's suffered enough. You have no right to drag her back to that nightmare." Matteo's gaze flickered between Sadie and William, his resolve wavering. He wanted to believe she was lying, that she was the villain he had been searching for all these years. But the raw emotion in her voice, the pain etched into her face, it didn't fit the image of the heartless woman who had haunted his memories. The weight of a decision. Elijah, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "You're so focused on the past that you can't see what's right in front of you. My mom is a good person. She made mistakes, but she spent her whole life trying to make up for them. And now you're here, acting like you're the only one who suffered." Matteo's fists clenched at his sides, Elijah's words cutting deeper than he expected. He had spent so long letting his hatred define him, letting it fuel his actions and justify his biases. But now, standing in this broken home, faced with a family clinging to each other for survival, Matteo felt something shift. "Even if what you're saying is true," Matteo said slowly, his voice heavy with conflict, "you still have to answer for what happened. You can't just run from it forever." Sadie met his gaze, her expression a mixture of resignation and defiance. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly. "If you want to take me in, do it. But know this, I've spent my life paying for those mistakes. And if you think locking me up will fix anything, you're wrong." A turning point. The room fell silent again, the weight of Sadie's words hanging in the air. Matteo stood frozen, torn between his duty as an officer and the nagging feeling that justice wasn't as black and white as he had always believed. For the first time, Matteo considered the possibility that redemption was more complicated than punishment, that forgiveness required more courage than hate. As he looked into Sadie's tear-filled eyes, he realized that the decision he made now would define not just her future, but his own. And for the first time in years, Matteo didn't know what to do. The weight of forgiveness. The silence in the room was deafening. Matteo Russo, the hardened police officer, stood at the center of a moral crossroads, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. Sadie Thompson's tearful confession had cracked something deep inside him, a chasm between his unyielding sense of duty and the festering hatred that had defined him for so long. Sadie remained in her wheelchair, her frail hands gripping the edges tightly as though she were bracing for an inevitable storm. Behind her, William stood resolute, his eyes a mixture of fear and defiance. Elijah, the youngest in the room, stared Matteo down with quiet intensity, daring him to say or do something that would further harm his family. Matteo's mind raced. For decades, he had clung to the narrative that all black people were criminals, an idea born from his childhood trauma. But now, as he stood in this crumbling home, surrounded by people who had been beaten down by life, his convictions wavered. The truth wasn't as simple as he wanted it to be. A reflection of suffering. The room felt smaller as Matteo's memories crowded in. He saw himself as a terrified 5-year-old boy, locked in a dark shed with the other kidnapped children. He remembered the stench of sweat and decay, the gnawing hunger, the sound of sobbing in the darkness. The image of the woman with the crescent-shaped birthmark haunted him. She had been strong, commanding, a force of terror in his young mind. And yet, looking at Sadie now, Matteo saw none of that. She was fragile, broken, and riddled with regret. "Why didn't you stop him?" Matteo's voice broke the silence, his tone more pleading than accusatory. "You could have saved us. Why didn't you do anything?" Sadie flinched as though struck. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Lawrence controlled me, body and soul. He wasn't just a man to me. He was a prison. Every time I thought about standing up to him, I saw the consequences, and I froze. I hated myself for it then. And I still do now. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Matteo wanted to lash out, to hold on to the anger that had fueled him for so long. But the cracks in his resolve were widening. William stepped forward, his voice low but firm. She's told you the truth. She's lived with this guilt for decades. Isn't that punishment enough? A lifetime of pain. Matteo turned his gaze to William, studying the man who had stood by Sadie's side, despite everything. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Did you know about all of this?" William shook his head. "I didn't meet Sadie until years after it happened. When she finally told me the truth, I was angry at her, angry at the world. But I saw how much she hated herself for what she'd been a part of. She didn't need me to punish her. Life was already doing that." Elijah, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his eyes blazing with emotion. "You think you're the only one who suffered?" he asked Matteo, his voice sharp. "You don't know what it's like to grow up in a system that crushes you before you even have a chance to stand. My mom made mistakes, but she's paid for them every single day. And now you're here, trying to rip her apart all over again." Matteo's gaze snapped to Elijah, the young man's words hitting him harder than he expected. For years, Matteo had told himself that he was the victim, that his pain was unique. But Elijah's anger forced him to confront a harsh truth. Pain didn't belong to him alone. It was a universal experience, carried differently by everyone. A turning point. Matteo's grip on his baton loosened as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He looked at Sadie, at the lines etched into her face, the sorrow in her eyes. He looked at William, standing protectively behind her, his love for her evident in every gesture. And he looked at Elijah, a young man who had every reason to hate him, but instead stood firm, demanding justice for his family. Matteo took a step back, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But I also don't know if I can keep carrying this hatred." Sadie's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope breaking through her despair. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said softly. "I only hope you can find peace." The ripple of redemption. For the first time in years, Matteo felt the icy grip of his hatred begin to thaw. It wasn't an easy process, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But standing in that room, surrounded by a family that had suffered in their own way, Matteo realized that holding onto his anger would only keep him trapped in the past. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notepad. "I'm not going to arrest you," he said, his voice steady. "But I need your help. I need to know everything about Lawrence, where he went, what he did after the kidnapping. If he's still out there, I need to find him." Sadie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll tell you everything I know," she promised. "If it helps bring him to justice, I'll do whatever it takes." William placed a hand on Sadie's shoulder, his eyes meeting Matteo's. "Thank you," he said simply. A new path. As Matteo left the dilapidated home, he felt lighter than he had in years. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding himself, seeking out Lawrence, and coming to terms with his past. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. The slums faded into the background as Matteo walked back toward his car, the weight of his badge feeling less like a burden and more like a responsibility. He had always thought justice was about punishment, about retribution. But now he was beginning to see that it was also about understanding, about building bridges instead of walls. And as the city skyline rose before him, Matteo Russo decided that his story wasn't finished. It was only just beginning. Searching for truth. Matteo Russo sat in his car outside the dilapidated apartment building, staring blankly at the windshield. The confession he had heard from Sadie Thompson weighed heavily on his mind. Her story of Lawrence, the controlling and dangerous man who had orchestrated the kidnappings, had shaken Matteo's long-held beliefs. The hate he had nurtured for decades, his burning need for vengeance, now felt misplaced, or at the very least misdirected. Sadie wasn't the monster he had envisioned for so long, but the specter of Lawrence loomed larger than ever. For Matteo, finding Lawrence wasn't just about solving an old case. It was about confronting the man who had turned his life into a living nightmare. It was about finding closure, not just for himself, but for the children who had suffered alongside him all those years ago. Sadie had promised to help, but her memories of Lawrence were fragmented and incomplete, blurred by the passage of time and the trauma she had endured. Matteo knew that tracking him down would require digging deeper, looking in places where others had stopped searching. The trail grows cold. Matteo began by revisiting the old case files, poring over every detail as if seeing them for the first time. The records were sparse. Police sketches of Lawrence and his accomplice, witness testimonies that painted conflicting pictures, and grainy photographs of the shed where the children had been held. There was no physical evidence tying Lawrence to the crime, and the investigation had hit a dead end when the ransom was paid, allowing the perpetrators to vanish without a trace. Sadie's story added a few crucial pieces to the puzzle. She described Lawrence as a charismatic manipulator, a man who could charm anyone into doing his bidding. He had a penchant for disappearing into the shadows, changing his identity and resurfacing in different cities. According to Sadie, he had spoken about leaving the country after the kidnappings, but she had no idea if he had followed through. Matteo tapped his pen against the desk, frustration gnawing at him. He had spent years burying his trauma, refusing to revisit the past, and now it felt like he was grasping at ghosts. He needed a fresh lead, something, anything, that could point him in the right direction. A breakthrough. One evening, as Matteo sifted through old police records, a name jumped out at him: Clarence Lawrence Wilkes. It was a name that had appeared briefly in the original investigation, mentioned by an anonymous tipster who claimed to have seen a man matching Lawrence's description in a nearby town. The lead had been dismissed at the time, overshadowed by more pressing avenues of inquiry. Matteo's heart raced as he dug deeper. He found an old address associated with Wilkes, a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. It was a long shot, but Matteo knew he had to follow it. The next morning, Matteo drove to the address, his nerves on edge. The motel was a decaying relic of the past, its peeling paint and broken neon sign a testament to years of neglect. Matteo approached the front desk, where an elderly clerk looked up from a newspaper. "Excuse me," Matteo said, flashing his badge. "I'm looking for information about a man named Clarence Wilkes. He might have stayed here a long time ago." The clerk squinted at Matteo, his face creased with suspicion. "That name don't ring a bell," he said gruffly, "but I don't remember half the people who come through here." Matteo nodded, trying to mask his disappointment. "Do you have old records? Guest logs, anything like that?" The clerk sighed, muttering under his breath as he shuffled to a back room. After a few minutes, he returned with a dusty ledger. Matteo flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the names and dates, and then he saw it. Clarence Wilkes, July 1988. "He was here," Matteo said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Do you remember anything about him?" The clerk shook his head. "Sorry, Hid. That was a long time ago." But Matteo wasn't deterred. The entry confirmed that Lawrence had been in the area after the kidnappings. It was a small breakthrough, but it was enough to reignite Matteo's determination. Reaching out. Back at the station, Matteo decided to enlist help. He called in a favor from an old friend, Detective Lisa Warren, who specialized in cold cases. Lisa was a no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. "Lawrence Wilkes," Lisa said, scribbling the name in her notebook. "If he's still alive, we'll find him. But I have to ask, why now? This case is ancient history." Matteo hesitated, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. "Because it still matters," he said finally. "To me. To the people who suffered because of him. We owe it to them to get justice. Lisa studied Matteo for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's get to work. Over the next few weeks, Lisa and Matteo scoured databases, tracked down old associates of Lawrence, and followed up on every lead they could find. Their search took them to abandoned warehouses, seedy bars, and forgotten neighborhoods, piecing together the fractured life of a man who had spent decades on the run. A chilling discovery. One day, Lisa called Matteo with news. I found something, she said. You're going to want to see this. They met at the station, where Lisa handed Matteo a file. Inside were records of a man named James Lawrence, who had been arrested in a small town 2 years ago for petty theft. The mugshot showed a gaunt, weathered man with hollow eyes, but the resemblance to Lawrence Wilkes was unmistakable. He's using an alias, Lisa explained. The fingerprints match. It's him. Matteo's hands trembled as he held the file. After all these years, Lawrence Wilkes had finally resurfaced. But the arrest report raised more questions than answers. Lawrence had been released shortly after his arrest, and his current whereabouts were unknown. We have to find him, Matteo said, his voice firm. This is our chance. The hunt intensifies. With Lisa's help, Matteo tracked Lawrence's movements, piecing together a trail that led them to a remote town on the edge of the state. Lawrence had been living under the radar, working odd jobs and staying in cheap motels. He was a shadow of the man Matteo remembered, but his crimes were no less heinous. As they closed in, Matteo felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He had spent his entire life wanting revenge, but now, standing on the precipice of justice, he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Would confronting Lawrence bring him closure, or would it simply reopen old wounds? A reckoning approaches. The search brought Matteo to the edge of everything he thought he knew about himself. For years, he had been defined by his anger, his hatred, his need for retribution. But now, as the truth came into focus, Matteo realized that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about healing the broken. As he prepared for the final confrontation, Matteo couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change him forever. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what that change might bring. The final confrontation. Matteo Russo drove in silence, the hum of his car engine the only sound breaking the stillness of the early morning. The address Detective Lisa Warren had provided sat crumpled in his hand, a single scrap of paper that held the weight of decades of pain and unanswered questions. He was on his way to confront Clarence Lawrence Wilkes, the man who had orchestrated his childhood kidnapping and left scars on his life that still bled. The small town where Lawrence now lived was unremarkable. Narrow streets, weathered houses, and a sense of quiet resignation in the air. Matteo parked his car in front of a rundown duplex at the edge of town, the address scrawled on the paper matching the peeling numbers nailed above the door. His heart pounded as he stepped out of the car, every step toward the house feeling heavier than the last. He wasn't just here as a cop. He was here as a victim, a man seeking closure for wounds that had festered for too long. Matteo paused at the door, his hand hovering over the worn wood before he knocked. Face to face. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges to reveal a man who was a ghost of his former self. Lawrence Wilkes stood in the doorway, his once intimidating frame reduced to a gaunt, fragile silhouette. His hair was thin and graying, his skin weathered, and his eyes hollow, eyes that had haunted Matteo's nightmares for years. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Matteo's chest tightened as he took in the sight of the man who had stolen his innocence, who had turned his childhood into a prison of fear. Lawrence's gaze met Matteo's, and there was no flicker of recognition, no sign that he remembered the boy he had terrorized so long ago. "Can I help you?" Lawrence asked, his voice raspy and tired. Matteo took a deep breath, his hand instinctively resting on the badge clipped to his belt. "Clarence Wilkes?" he asked, his tone steady but tense. Lawrence frowned. "I haven't gone by that name in years," he said. "Who's asking?" "I'm Detective Matteo Russo," Matteo said, stepping closer. We need to talk. Lawrence's face tightened, a flicker of fear passing through his eyes. He hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "All right," he said. "Come in." The weight of the past. The inside of the house was sparse and cluttered, a stark reflection of a man who had spent his life running from his past. Matteo followed Lawrence into the living room, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might tell them more about the man he was about to confront. Lawrence gestured to a worn couch, but Matteo remained standing. "Do you know why I'm here?" Matteo asked, his voice sharp. Lawrence sighed, lowering himself into a chair with visible effort. "I've done a lot of things in my life," he admitted. "You'll have to be more specific." Matteo's fists clenched at his sides. 35 years ago, you kidnapped me and several other children. You locked us in a shed, starved us, and demanded ransom from our families." Lawrence's eyes widened, his face paling. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze darting to the floor. "You've got the wrong man," he said weakly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Matteo snapped, his voice rising. "I remember you. I remember your voice, your face, and I remember the woman you worked with, the one with the crescent-shaped birthmark." At the mention of the birthmark, Lawrence froze. His eyes met Matteo's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition. A broken confession. Lawrence leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping. "So, you're one of them," he said softly. "One of the kids." Matteo's breath caught in his throat. "You admit it then. You did it." Lawrence nodded slowly, his hands trembling as he ran them through his thinning hair. "I did a lot of things I'm not proud of," he said. "But that was the worst. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did." Matteo's anger flared. "What do you mean, not supposed to happen?" "You locked us in a shed like animals, terrified us, hurt us." "I know," Lawrence said, his voice breaking. "I know, but you have to understand. I was desperate. I was drowning in debt, living on the edge. And then she came along." "She?" Matteo's jaw tightened. "You mean Sadie?" Lawrence shook his head. "No, not Sadie. Her name was Marlene. She was the one who came up with the plan, the one who convinced me it would work. She said no one would get hurt, that it would be over quickly, but it all spiraled out of control." Matteo stared at Lawrence, his mind racing. Sadie had never mentioned Marlene. Had she been lying? Or had she been a pawn in Marlene's game, just like Lawrence claimed to be? A fragile truth. As Lawrence continued to talk, Matteo began to see the cracks in his story. Lawrence painted himself as a victim, a man coerced into committing terrible acts by a manipulative partner. But Matteo couldn't shake the feeling that Lawrence was downplaying his own role, deflecting responsibility onto a woman who wasn't there to defend herself. "Why should I believe you?" Matteo asked, his voice cold. "You've lied and hurt people your entire life. How do I know you're not lying now?" Lawrence's gaze fell to the floor. "You don't," he said simply, "but I'm tired of running. If you want to arrest me, go ahead. Maybe it's time I paid for what I've done." Matteo's hand hovered over his badge. The man before him was a shell of who he had been decades ago, a broken figure whose guilt and shame were etched into every line on his face. Arresting him would be easy, but Matteo wondered if it would truly bring him the closure he sought. A decision. As Matteo stood in that small, cluttered living room, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. He had spent his life chasing justice, but now he realized that justice wasn't as black and white as he had always believed. Lawrence deserved to pay for his crimes, but Matteo wasn't sure if putting him behind bars would heal the wounds that had haunted him for so long. Instead of pulling out his handcuffs, Matteo pulled out his notepad. "Give me everything you know about Marlene," he said. "If she's still out there, I'm going to find her." Lawrence hesitated, then nodded. He began to recount details about Marlene, her habits, her last known whereabouts, the way she had vanished after the kidnappings. Matteo wrote everything down, his resolve hardening. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Letting go. As Matteo drove away from Lawrence's house, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the quiet town. For the first time in years, Matteo felt a sense of peace. He hadn't found all the answers he was looking for, but he had taken the first step toward understanding. He was no longer the terrified boy locked in a shed, nor the angry man consumed by hatred. He was something new, someone who could move forward, who could heal. And as the road stretched out before him, Matteo realized that the truth wasn't just about finding those who had wronged him. It was about finding himself.